4:15 in the afternoon. The Gulf of Oman. USS Bataan was maintaining a steady course of 110 degrees when the first electronic warfare alarm shattered the professional quiet of the bridge. It was not a routine system check, and the incoming thermal signature was moving too fast for anything but a land-based anti-ship cruise missile. The humid air off the coast of Iran hung heavy over the flight deck, smelling of salt and the faint metallic tang of specialized radar coating. Below the surface, the deep blue water of the Gulf remained deceptively calm, showing no sign of the violence that was now seconds away from the hull. In the Combat Information Center, the Tactical Information Coordinator stared at a flickering green icon that had just blossomed on his console. The contact had originated from a mobile launcher near the Iranian port of Jask, crossing the coastline at a speed of Mach 0.9. He did not hesitate, shouting the warning that every sailor in the United States Navy is trained to hear but hopes to never experience. Vampire, vampire, vampire. Bearing 015, range 12 miles and closing. The commanding officer of the USS Bataan immediately ordered a hard turn to starboard, hoping to present the narrowest possible profile to the incoming threat. The 40,000-ton amphibious assault ship shuddered as her massive rudders bit into the sea, the deck tilting at an angle that sent loose equipment sliding across the hangar deck below. The ship's defensive systems, governed by the ship's self-defense system, began their automated logic cycles at speeds beyond human reaction. 5 miles to the west, the escorting destroyer, DDG-63, began its own defensive sequence. The destroyer's AN/SPY-1 radar locked onto the incoming Noor missile, a reverse-engineered version of the C-802, which was currently skimming just 10 meters above the wavetops. The destroyer launched 2 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles in rapid succession, the rockets tearing out of the Mark 41 vertical launch system with a roar that could be heard across the open water. The first interceptor missile malfunctioned, spinning harmlessly into the sea 3 miles out. The second interceptor found its mark, detonating 50 feet above the Noor missile, but the kinetic force was not enough to destroy the heavy Iranian warhead. It merely shredded the guidance fins of the Noor, sending the weapon into a wobbling, erratic flight path that bypassed the Bataan's primary defensive layers. On the starboard side of the Bataan, the rolling airframe missile launcher fired a single interceptor. The small missile shrieked off the rail, leaving a spiral of white smoke against the hazy afternoon sky. It missed the target by less than 3 meters as the Noor performed a terminal pop-up maneuver, a programmed climb designed to bypass the last line of defense before diving into the target's deck. The final line of defense, the close-in weapon system, erupted in a continuous, buzzing roar. The 20mm Gatling gun spat out a stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 75 shots per second. Tracers lanced out toward the horizon, stitching a line of white splashes across the water, but the Noor was already through the kill zone. The impact was a physical blow that felt as if the entire ship had been dropped onto solid concrete. The Noor missile, carrying a 364-pound high-explosive warhead, punched through the thin skin of the hull on the port side, just forward of the aft elevator. The weapon did not detonate on the exterior. It traveled 10 meters into the interior of the ship, passing through a storage compartment for aviation fuel hoses before the fuse triggered the main charge. The resulting explosion was a brilliant orange flash that bleached the color out of the surrounding sea for a fraction of a second. A massive section of the hull plating, 6 meters wide and 4 meters high, was blown outward into the water. Inside the ship, the blast wave compressed the air with such force that it blew out every light fixture and shattered every computer monitor within 100 feet of the impact zone. The sound of the detonation was followed immediately by the roar of rushing air as a fireball, fueled by vaporized jet fuel, surged upward through the elevator well. Black, oily smoke began to pour from the wound in the ship's side, rising into the clear sky in a column that could be seen from 30 miles away. On the bridge, The commanding officer felt the deck beneath his boots vibrating with a new, uneven rhythm as the ship's internal alarms transitioned from the high-pitched wail of an incoming attack to the steady, rhythmic pulse of general quarters. All hands. General quarters. General quarters. The overhead speakers blared. The voice of the boatswains, mate tight with controlled adrenaline, prepare for heavy weather and damage control. This is not a drill. On the hangar deck, the scene was one of professional chaos. Sailors in fire-retardant suits were already dragging heavy hoses toward the aft section, where the heat was becoming unbearable. The smell of burning rubber, hydraulic fluid, and scorched paint filled the enclosed space. The USS Bataan was wounded, listing 3 degrees to port as the first of the seawater pumps began to fight against the flooding in the lower compartments. The battle for the ship had begun. 4:20 in the afternoon, the hangar deck of the USS Bataan. The interior of the massive ship was no longer a structured military environment. It had become a cavern of choking black smoke and screaming metal. The air was thick with the acrid, chemical stench of burning hydraulic fluid and the scorched remains of non-skid deck coating. Visibility had dropped to less than 5 meters as the ventilation systems, damaged by the initial blast wave, struggled to clear the toxic fumes. Every few seconds, the ship would groan, a deep, structural protest that vibrated through the steel soles of every sailor's boots. Damage Controlman Second Class Miller led the attack team from Repair Locker 5, moving toward the primary impact point near the aft elevator. He was encased in a heavy, gold-tinted fire proximity suit, his breathing echoing loudly inside his oxygen mask. Behind him, 4 sailors struggled with a 2.5-inch fire hose, the fabric stiff with the pressure of the seawater surging through it. They were the flying squad, the first line of defense against a fire that was currently threatening to consume the entire rear third of the ship. As they rounded a corner into the main hangar bay, they were met by a wall of heat that reached 250 degrees. The Noor missile had breached the storage area for aviation fuel lines, and the fire was now a Class Bravo conflagration, a liquid fuel blaze that roared with a terrifying, low-frequency hunger. The flames were licking at the overhead, melting the insulation off the electrical cables and sending drips of molten plastic raining down, like orange sparks. "Activate the aqueous film forming foam," Miller shouted over the radio, his voice distorted by the mask. A moment later, the nozzles at the end of the hoses erupted with a thick, white chemical blanket. The foam hissed as it hit the burning fuel, creating a barrier that cut off the oxygen supply to the fire. It was a slow, agonizing process. For every meter the team gained, the shifting of the ship and the heat of the bulkheads threatened to reignite the fuel behind them. The deck was slick with a mixture of foam, seawater, and oil, making every step a gamble. Below them, in the engineering spaces, the situation was equally dire. The explosion had severed a major saltwater cooling line, and the aft engine room was taking on water at a rate of 500 gallons per minute. The water was already knee-deep, swirling with debris and dark patches of diesel. The chief engineer, a 20-year veteran, stood on a narrow catwalk, coordinating the efforts to plug the breach. "Get the pone. 100 pumps online," the chief engineer barked into his headset. "I want those suction lines in the bilge now. If we lose the aft generators, this ship goes dark, and we lose the fire pumps." 2 sailors worked in the waist-deep water, wrestling with a heavy mechanical patch made of wood and steel. They were trying to shore up a split in the hull plating where the missile's kinetic energy had buckled the frame. The sound of their hammers striking the steel shoring was a frantic, rhythmic metallic clanging that competed with the roar of the incoming sea. The water was freezing, a sharp contrast to the inferno raging just 2 decks above them. On the bridge, the commanding officer watched the damage control console with grim focus. The USS Bataan was now listing 5 degrees to port. The ship's speed had dropped to 10 knots, making her a sluggish target for any follow-on attacks. Through the thick glass of the bridge windows, he could see the destroyer, DDG-63, circling the Bataan like a protective wolf, its radar arrays spinning at maximum revolutions as it searched for a second missile launch. The medical teams were already in motion. In the ship's primary triage center, the air smelled of antiseptic and sweat. 14 sailors had been caught. In the initial blast, 3 were being treated for severe smoke inhalation, and 2 more had sustained compound fractures when the deck buckled beneath them. The Navy corpsmen moved with practiced efficiency, their hands steady even as the ship shuddered from a secondary, internal explosion, likely a pressurized canister in a maintenance shop cook-off. By 4:45 in the afternoon, the immediate threat of the ship sinking had been mitigated, but the fire was far from under control. The internal temperature in the aft hangar remained high enough to weaken the structural integrity of the flight deck above. The crew of the USS Bataan was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against the invisible enemy on the Iranian coast, and one against the physics of fire and day, water that sought to drag their ship to the bottom of the Gulf. As the sun began to dip toward the finite horizon, casting a long, blood-red light across the smoking deck, the first reports from Pacific Command began to filter through the satellite link. The United States Navy was not going to let this strike go unanswered. While the sailors on the Bataan fought for their lives, 300 miles to the south, the engines of the carrier strike group were already beginning to churn the water into a white froth. 5:15 in the afternoon. Naval support activity, Bahrain, and the North Arabian Sea. Inside the windowless, chilled environment of the Naval Forces Central Command Headquarters in Bahrain, the atmosphere was one of clinical, high-intensity focus. Large screen displays spanned the front wall, illuminated by the shifting blue and red icons of the Global Command and Control System. The icon for the USS Bataan was flashing a rhythmic, urgent amber, a digital signal of a capital ship in distress. Surrounding it, the green icons of the United States Navy escort ships were already shifting into a defensive screen, their sensor footprints expanding to cover the gap left by the wounded assault ship. The commander of the 5th Fleet stood at the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the real-time satellite feed of the Gulf of Oman. A thick column of black smoke was clearly visible from space, trailing behind the Bataan like a dark ribbon. The reports from the ship were sobering, but indicated the crew was holding the line. He turned to his operations officer, his voice calm, but possessing the weight of immediate authority. "I want a full combat radius established around the Bataan within 20 minutes. Nothing moves in that water or that airspace without our permission." 300 miles to the south, the USS Gerald R. was already answering the call. The massive nuclear-powered carrier, the lead ship of carrier, Strike Group 12, began a heavy turn to port, its 4 shafts driving the 100,000-ton vessel to a speed of 30 knots. The vibration of the high-speed transit could be felt through every deck of the ship, a low-frequency hum that signaled the transition from patrol to combat operations. On the 4.5-acre flight deck, the yellow-shirted flight deck officers were moving with a practiced, aggressive urgency. The air above the carrier was thick with the smell of JP-5 jet fuel and the roar of dual-engine ignitions. 2 E-2 Charlie Hawkeye early warning aircraft were the first to launch, their massive rotodomes spinning as they climbed into the humid sky. These aircraft would serve as the God's eye for the fleet, using their powerful AN/APS 145 radars to scan hundreds of miles of Iranian coastline, looking for the telltale electronic signature of another Noor missile battery. Immediately following the Hawkeyes, the flight deck crews prepared a squadron of 12 FA-18 Super Hornet fighters. The aircraft were heavily laden with a mix of AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles for self-defense and 8 AGM-88 HARM missiles for destroying enemy radar sites. Each fighter was a masterpiece of lethal technology, its wings glistening with condensation. In the afternoon heat, one by one, the electromagnetic catapults fired with a metallic clack and a rush of ionizing air. hurling the 60,000-pound jets into the sky in less than 2 seconds. The strategic objective was clear: establish absolute air and sea superiority over the Gulf of Oman to prevent a follow-up strike while the Bataan was vulnerable. The tactical plan involved 3 layers of protection. The outer layer consisted of the Super Hornets, patrolling at 30,000 feet to intercept any Iranian Phantom or 14 fighters that might attempt to interfere. The middle layer was managed by the cruisers and destroyers of the strike group. Their Mark 41 vertical launch systems, primed with hundreds of surface-to-air missiles. The inner layer was the Bataan's own remaining defenses and its close-in escort. As the fighters leveled off and turned north, their pilots toggled their multifunction displays to the Link 16 tactical data network. They could see the entire battlefield in digital clarity, the position of every friendly ship, the projected path of the Bataan, and the known locations of Iranian coastal defense sites. The tension in the cockpits was palpable. The only sound the steady hiss of oxygen and the occasional burst of encrypted radio traffic. Back in Bahrain, the intelligence officers were sifting through a mountain of electronic data. They were looking for the specific fingerprint of the mobile Noor launcher that had fired the shot. These batteries were notoriously difficult to find, often hidden in reinforced concrete bunkers or disguised as civilian commercial trucks. However, the launch had left a thermal scar on the atmosphere that the high-altitude sensors had captured. "We have a probable point of origin," an intelligence specialist announced, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "Coordinates 25 degrees 42 minutes north, 57 degrees 51 minutes east. The battery is likely moving toward a concealment site 3 miles inland from the coast." The commander of the 5th Fleet leaned over the specialist's shoulder, his jaw tight. "Pass those coordinates to the Gerald R. Ford and the strike leaders. I want eyes on that launcher within 10 minutes. If it stops, or if it looks like it's preparing to fire again, they are cleared to engage." The response was no longer just about rescue. It was about retribution and the restoration of deterrence. The massive machinery of the United States military was fully awake, and its focus was narrowing onto a small strip of coastline in southern Iran. The next hour would determine if the conflict remained a localized engagement or spiraled into a full-scale regional war. 5:45 in the afternoon, the coastline of southern Iran near the port of Jask. A Pate Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft was banking hard over the Gulf of Oman, its multi-static active coherent sonar and long-range infrared sensors slaved to the coordinates provided by Bahrain. The air at 20,000 feet was cold and thin, a stark contrast to the humid, smoke-filled chaos on the deck of the USS Bataan 60 miles to the west. Below the aircraft, the rugged, sun-bleached mountains of the Iranian coast rose sharply from the sea, casting long, jagged shadows across the coastal highway that wound through the salt flats. Inside the pressurized cabin of the Pate, the tactical coordinator sat in front of a high-definition workstation, his face illuminated by the cool blue light of the sensor displays. He was scanning the landscape with the AN/APY-10 radar, a system capable of detecting a periscope in heavy seas, or, in this case, a mobile missile launcher hiding among the coastal scrub. "I have a hotspot," he announced, his voice steady through the intercom. "Bearing 095, 4 miles inland from the primary launch site." The sensor operator adjusted the MX-20 electro-optical turret, zooming in on a plume of dust moving rapidly away from the coast. On the infrared screen, a large vehicle appeared as a bright white ghost against the cooling earth. It was a heavy 6-wheeled truck, its silhouette dominated by the rectangular shapes of 2 large missile canisters mounted on the rear bed. The vehicle was traveling at 60 kilometers per hour, kicking up a trail of fine sand as it headed toward a cluster of reinforced concrete structures built into the side of a nearby ridge. "Target confirmed," the coordinator said, his heart rate increasing as he cross-referenced the thermal signature with the known profile of an Iranian Noor coastal defense battery. "This is the shooter. He's trying to go to ground before the sun sets." The Pate did not carry the heavy ordnance required to penetrate a reinforced bunker, but it served as the critical link in the kill chain. Using the Link 16 tactical data network, the crew transmitted the precise GPS coordinates 25 degrees 43 minutes north, 57 degrees 52 minutes east, directly to the flight of FA-18 Super Hornets, now screaming across the Gulf at Mach 1.2. The strike leader, call sign Jolly 11, acknowledged the data burst. His cockpit was a symphony of electronic chirps, and the steady, powerful roar of the two 414 engines behind him. On his heads-up display, a small diamond appeared, marking the exact location of the Noor battery. He flipped a switch on his throttle, transitioning his radar from air-to-air mode to synthetic aperture ground mapping. "I have the track," the pilot reported. "The target is entering a ravine. We need to hit him before he reaches the overhead cover." The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex. To reach the battery, the American fighters would have to enter Iranian sovereign airspace, an act that would escalate the engagement from a defensive skirmish to a direct strike on Iranian territory. In the Carrier Intelligence Center aboard the USS Gerald R. the decision was made in seconds. The Noor battery remained a persistent threat to the wounded Bataan and the rest of the strike group. Under the standing rules of engagement for self-defense, the order was given, execute, neutralize the threat. The Pate Poseidon continued to circle at a distance, its sensors locked onto the truck like a laser. The Iranian vehicle was now only 200 meters from the entrance of a camouflaged tunnel. The driver, likely aware of the American aircraft overhead, was driving with desperate speed, the heavy truck bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. The infrared feed showed the heat of the truck's engine glowing intensely, a perfect beacon for the incoming ordnance. Pelican 6-7 to Jolly 11. The Pate coordinator called out. "Target is 30 seconds from concealment. You are cleared hot. Repeat, cleared hot." The two Super Hornets began a steep dive. Their wings swept back as they plummeted toward the coastal range. The pilots felt the heavy pull of 4Gs as they leveled out at 5,000 feet, the ground rushing beneath them at nearly 1,200 kilometers per hour. The desert floor was a blur of brown and gray, punctuated only by the white-hot dot of the Noor launcher on their targeting pods. The hunt was over. The kill was about to begin. The coordination between the high-altitude eyes of the Poseidon and the low-altitude teeth of the Super Hornets had reduced the vast expanse of the Iranian coastline to a single, inescapable point in space and time. 6 in the evening. The airspace 40 miles off the coast of Iran. The two FA-18 Super Hornets of Jolly flight. They were now the tip of a precision-guided spear aimed at the heart of the Iranian coastal defense network. The orange glow of the setting sun reflected off the canopy of Jolly 11, casting a long, distorted shadow of the fighter jet across the white-capped waves of the Gulf of Oman. The air at 15,000 feet was crystalline and freezing, a sharp contrast to the shimmering heat haze rising from the Iranian salt flats just ahead. In the cockpit, the pilot checked his master arm switch, moving it to the arm position with a tactile click that resonated through his flight gloves. The tactical situation transitioned from a search to a dynamic engagement in less than 10 seconds. As the Super Hornets crossed the 15-mile mark from the coastline, the onboard AN/APG-79 radar detected a sharp spike in electronic activity. An Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile site located on a ridge overlooking the port of Jask had just transitioned from search mode to a dedicated target track. Inside the cockpit, the radar warning receiver erupted in a frantic, high-pitched warble, and a red threat icon began to flash on the center console. Jolly 11, I have. A track-while scan from the ridge. The wingman, Jolly 12, reported. His voice was calm, filtered through the heavy rhythmic hiss of his oxygen regulator. The HQ-9 is looking at us. Request permission to suppressed. Jolly 11, copy. Magnum, Magnum, Magnum. The strike leader replied. The pilot of The lead Fa-18 fighter squeezed the red trigger on the front of his stick. Beneath the left wing, an AGM-88 HARM missile ignited. The rocket motor kicked in with a physical jolt that shook the entire airframe, and the missile tore off the rail in a cloud of white chemical smoke. The HARM missile, specifically designed to home in on enemy radar emissions, climbed steeply into the darkening sky, its internal computer calculating the exact frequency of the Iranian radar site. As the HARM missile streaked toward the coast at Mach 2.0, the Super Hornets dove toward the deck to minimize their radar cross-section. They were now flying at only 500 feet above the water, the salt spray occasionally blurring the sensors of their targeting pods. The speed was 850 kilometers per hour. The roar of the engines, echoing off the surface of the sea. 5 miles inland, the Iranian radar operators realized their error and attempted to shut down the transmitter, but it was too late. The AGM-88 HARM missile had already memorized the last known coordinates. The missile dived into the radar van with a kinetic force of over 3,000 pounds, the high-explosive fragmentation warhead detonating 10 feet above the array. The radar dish was shredded into thousands of pieces of jagged metal, and the secondary explosion of the control vehicle sent a plume of oily fire 100 feet into the air. With the primary air defense radar neutralized, the path was clear for the strike on the Noor battery itself. The Fa-18 fighters pulled up into a high-altitude loft maneuver, gaining 3,000 feet of altitude in seconds. This move provided the necessary range for their primary dash ordnance. The GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack Munition. These were 500-pound bombs converted into precision-guided weapons using an internal GPS guidance kit. Target is locked on the infrared, Jolly 11 confirmed. On his targeting display, the mobile Noor launcher was a bright, distinct heat signature. Still, struggling to reach the mouth of the ravine, the truck was now less than 50 meters from the relative safety of the concrete tunnel. The Blight pilot aligned the crosshairs of his targeting pod exactly on the engine block of the heavy six-wheeled vehicle. Bombs away, 2 away, the pilot announced. The 2 GBU-38 munitions fell away from the aircraft, their guidance fins immediately snapping into position to catch the air. They were silent, invisible killers, falling at a steep angle toward the desert floor. The pilots watched the countdown timer on their displays. 10 seconds to impact. 9, 8. The tension in the cockpit was absolute, the only sound the faint hum of the aircraft's internal cooling fans. The coordinate-based logic of the munitions was flawless. Despite the driver of the Noor launcher's attempt to execute a sharp turn into the shadows of the ravine, the GPS guidance corrected the flight path in real time. The first bomb hit the ground 10 meters behind the truck, the shockwave lifting the rear wheels off the sand. The second bomb was a direct hit. It struck the center of the missile canisters. The kinetic energy of the impact alone sufficient to crush the steel frames before the fuse detonated the main charge. The result was a catastrophic secondary explosion. The 2 Noor missiles inside the canisters, still fully fueled with volatile solid-state propellant, ignited simultaneously. A massive fireball of white and violet flame erupted from the floor of the ravine, reaching a temperature of over 2,000 degrees. The heat was so intense that it instantly vaporized the aluminum skin of the truck and fused the sand beneath it into a black, glass-like slag. Target destroyed, Jolly 11 reported, his voice dropping an octave as the adrenaline began to recede. The battery is neutralized. We are egressing to the south. As the Super Hornets banked hard toward the safety of the carrier strike group, the smoke from the destroyed battery rose in a straight black line against the twilight sky. The immediate threat to the USS Bataan had been removed, but the cost of the engagement was still being measured in the sky. Corridors of power in both Washington and Tehran. The United States had struck back, and the message was written in the burning wreckage of the ravine. 6:15 in the evening. The jagged ridgeline of the central Makran Range, 12 miles inland from the Iranian coast. The destruction of the mobile Noor launcher had been a tactical success, but the intelligence analysts aboard the USS Gerald R had identified a much larger threat: a hardened, subterranean command and control bunker carved directly into the limestone cliffs. This facility served as the brain for the entire coastal defense sector, housing the radar processing units and the remote triggering systems for 3 additional hidden missile batteries. As long as this node remained operational, every United States Navy vessel within 100 miles was in sustained danger. The sun was now a bruised purple on the horizon, casting the deep ravines into total shadow, while the sky above remained a pale, electric blue. The strike package for the command bunker consisted of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets, each carrying a pair of 2,000-pound GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions. These bunker busters were tipped with hardened steel noses, designed to punch through 20 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. To ensure the destruction of the facility, the aircraft would have to fly a precise target of opportunity profile, dropping the ordnance from a high angle to maximize kinetic penetration. The engagement turned into a violent, 2-way combat sequence as the American flight crossed the coastline. The Iranian defenders, now fully alerted and desperate to protect their primary command node, unleashed a wall of fire from a battery of Zu-23 twin-barrel anti-aircraft guns and shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. The trigger was squeezed. From the lead Super Hornet, callsign Jolly 11, the 2,000-pound munition separated from the centerline station with a heavy, metallic thud. The massive bomb tumbled for a fraction of a second before its GPS guidance. Fins bit into the thin mountain air, steering the weapon into a vertical scream toward the bunker's ventilation shaft. The pilot could feel the sudden lightness of the aircraft as the 1-ton weight vanished, the jet surging forward with a renewed, aggressive energy. The warhead punched straight through the mountain's limestone cap, the hardened steel nose driving 10 meters into the earth before the delayed action fuse reached its 0 count. The detonation was not a visible fireball on the surface. It was a localized earthquake that caused the entire side of the cliff to heave upward by 2 meters. Inside the bunker, the shockwave was catastrophic, traveling through the solid rock and compressing the air in the command center until the bulkheads buckled and the heavy blast doors were blown off their hinges. A fraction of a second later, a secondary plume of gray dust and pulverized concrete erupted from the canyon floor. As the internal structure of the facility collapsed into itself, the defender reacted with immediate, disorganized ferocity. From the darkened crevices of the surrounding hills, dozens of Iranian soldiers launched man-portable air defense systems. The sky was suddenly crisscrossed by the erratic, white-hot trails of heat-seeking missiles, their small rocket motors hissing like angry snakes. One missile exploded prematurely, just 50 meters beneath Jolly 12, the blast wave buffeting the fighter jet and sending a spray of shrapnel through the outer skin of the left tail fin. The pilot kicked the rudder hard, wrenching the nose of the FA-18 toward the horizon while dumping. A continuous stream of magnesium flares to decoy the remaining seekers. The immediate aftermath was a scene of absolute, suffocating destruction. The ridgeline where the command bunker had stood was now a jagged crater of broken rock and twisted rebar. The electronic chatter that had filled the Iranian radio bands for the last 2 hours went stone silent, replaced only by the crackle of static and the distant, muffled thud of secondary explosions deep within the mountain. The dust cloud from the collapse hung over the ravine like a heavy shroud, illuminated from beneath by the dull orange glow of burning electrical systems. The flight of Super Hornets did not linger to admire the damage. They banked hard toward the south, their afterburners twin points of white light against the darkening sky. They had broken the back of the coastal defense network, but the mission was far from over. Behind them, the Iranian coast was a landscape of fire and silence, while ahead, the wounded USS Bataan was still struggling to make headway through the heavy swells of the Gulf. As the aircraft cleared the coast, the strike leader checked his fuel state and his weapon stores. They had neutralized the primary threat, but the regional tension was now at a breaking point. The tactical victory in the mountains had cleared the way for the rescue and recovery phase, but the geopolitical fallout was only beginning to settle. The air in the cockpit was cold, the only sound the steady, mechanical breathing of the pilot as he guided his multi-million-dollar machine back toward the waiting deck of the carrier. 7 in the evening. The central Gulf of Oman, 30 miles southwest of the Iranian coastline. The sky had transitioned from a bruised purple to a deep, absolute black, leaving the sea as a vast, shifting void. The only light came from the rhythmic green glow of the bridge consoles. On the destroyer, DDG-63. The ship was positioned 2 miles off the port quarter of the USS Bataan, serving as a steel shield for the wounded assault ship. The Bataan was still trailing a thin, dark ribbon of smoke, her speed capped at 12 knots as her engineers fought to stabilize the internal bulkheads. The air was heavy, with the smell of salt and the cold, ozone scent of a coming squall, but the primary threat was no longer coming from the clouds. On the destroyer's bridge, the surface warfare officer adjusted the gain on the high-definition infrared sensor. Multiple surface contacts, bearing 045, range 8,000 yards. Speed 42 knots and increasing, he reported, his voice tight but controlled. On the monitor, 12 distinct white heat signatures were visible, cutting through the swells in a staggered V formation. These were Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast attack craft, small, highly maneuverable vessels armed with heavy machine guns and twin-rail rocket launchers. They were moving in a classic swarm configuration, designed to overwhelm a larger ship's defenses by attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. The commanding officer of the DDG-63 did not hesitate. The Iranian boats had ignored 3 warnings on the international bridge-to-bridge radio frequency and had crossed the 5,000-yard exclusion zone. Battery release. Engage the lead contacts with the 5-inch gun. Clear the Mark 38 mounts for close-in defense, he ordered. The ship's primary weapon, the Mark 45 5-inch 54 caliber gun, swung onto its target with a smooth, hydraulic wind. The automated loading system deep in the magazine cycled a 70-pound high-explosive round into the breech. The trigger was squeezed. The 5-inch gun erupted with a thunderous crack that shook the entire forward superstructure of the destroyer. A massive plume of white-hot flame punched out from the muzzle, illuminating the deck in a strobe light flash of orange. The physical shockwave rippled across the surface of the water, flattening the whitecaps for 50 meters in every direction. The smell of burnt cordite immediately washed back over the bridge, sharp and acrid. The 70-pound shell crossed the 4,000 yards of open water in less than 5 seconds. It struck the lead Iranian fast attack craft directly in the center of its fiberglass hull. The impact was absolute. The boat did not just sink, it ceased to exist as a single entity. The high explosive warhead detonated on contact with the engine block, sending a pillar of white water and burning gasoline 30 meters into the air. Fragments of the hull and the internal fuel tank were thrown outward in a 360-degree arc, shredding the water like a hailstorm. One moment, the boat was a white ghost on the infrared screen. The next, it was a scattered collection of burning debris settling into the Black Sea. The Defender reacted with frantic, aggressive desperation. The remaining 11 boats immediately broke formation, zigzagging wildly to avoid the destroyer's follow-on fire. They began to launch unguided 107mm XSA rockets, the projectiles leaving erratic, spiraling trails of white smoke in the darkness. Most fell harmlessly into the sea, sending up tall splashes of cold brine, but 2 rockets zipped over the aft deck of the destroyer, the heat of their motors felt by the sailors manning the machine gun mounts. The Iranian crews were shouting into their radios, their voices a chaotic overlay of commands as they attempted to close the distance to within range of their rocket-propelled grenades. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic, high-speed skirmish illuminated by the glow of tracers. The destroyer's 2 Mark 38 25mm chain guns began to cycle, their rhythmic thump 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 adding to the din. Each round carried a tracer element, creating long, glowing red lines that stitched across the waves. 2 more Iranian boats were caught in the crossfire, their engines smoking before they slowed to a halt, dead in the water. Seeing the overwhelming disparity in firepower and the destruction of their lead element, the remaining 8 boats turned hard to the north, heading back toward the safety of the Iranian territorial waters. "Ceasefire! Ceasefire!" the commanding officer ordered. "Break, track, and return to station. We need to stay on the Bataan's hip." The surface engagement had lasted less than 6 minutes, but it served as a brutal reminder of the volatility of the region. The DDG-63 resumed its position, the barrels of its guns still radiating heat into the cool night air. On the horizon, the burning remains of the first fast attack craft continued to flicker, a small, lonely fire on a vast and indifferent ocean. The Bataan continued her slow, agonizing crawl toward the south, her crew watching the dark water with renewed intensity. The skirmish was won, but the night was far from over. 9 in the evening. The flight deck of the USS Bataan was a landscape of strobing red lights and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of rotor blades. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, call signs Lone Star 1 and Lone Star 2, hovered precariously over the listing deck, their pilots fighting a 15-knot crosswind and the unpredictable heave of the wounded ship. The air was a thick soup of salt spray, diesel exhaust, and the lingering acrid scent of the fire that the damage control teams were still suppressed below. The deck itself was a treacherous surface, coated in a mixture of white firefighting foam and seawater that made every movement a gamble. The primary mission was the immediate casualty evacuation of the most severely injured sailors. Of the 14 initial casualties, 4 were classified as Priority 1, requiring the advanced surgical capabilities available aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford. The Navy corpsmen worked with desperate efficiency, their gloved hands steady as they strapped the wounded into specialized litters. They moved in teams of 4, leaning into the wind, their boots sliding on the slick, non-skid surface. As they approached the open side doors of the waiting helicopters, Lone Star 1, "You are clear to land on spot 3, the flight deck officer signaled with his glowing amber wands. The helicopter settled onto the deck with a metallic jar. The ship was currently listing 4 degrees to port, forcing the pilot to maintain partial power to keep the aircraft from sliding toward the edge. As soon as the wheels touched, the litter team surged forward, ducking under the spinning blades to load the casualties. The sound was a deafening roar of mechanical power, drowning out everything but the urgent commands relayed through the flight deck headsets. In less than 5 minutes, the 4 critical patients were secured. Lone Star 1 lifted off, its nose dipping as it accelerated into the blackness of the Gulf, banking toward the carrier strike group 60 miles to the south. Lone Star 2 remained on the deck, taking on the next tier of injured and delivering much-needed medical supplies, including 20 units of whole blood and specialized burn dressings. This aerial bridge was the only thing keeping the casualty count from rising. While the medical evacuation was underway, a different kind of logistics operation was taking place 3 decks below. The long tow was not yet a physical cable, but a desperate engineering struggle to keep the Bataan moving under her own power. The ship's primary propulsion had been restored to 40% capacity, but the structural integrity of the aft hull remained a critical concern. The chief engineer and a team of hull technicians were performing battlefield repairs in the flooded compartments, using heavy steel beams and hydraulic jacks to shore up the buckled bulkheads. The technical challenge was immense. The salt water in the flooded compartments acted as a massive, shifting weight that threatened to worsen the list with every heavy swell. To counter this, the engineering team began a process of counter-flooding, carefully admitting seawater into the starboard tanks to level the ship. It was a high-stakes balancing act. Too much water would sink the ship, while too little would leave her dangerously unstable in the increasing 5-meter swells. "We have the shoring in place on frame 220, a technician reported over the internal sound-powered phone. He was standing chest-deep in oily water, his face blackened by soot. "But the weld is weeping. "We need the underwater welding kit from the destroyer." The DDG-63, still maintaining its protective station, executed a precision maneuver known as a light line transfer. A thin nylon cord was shot across the gap between the two ships, using a pneumatic line thrower. Once the connection was established, a heavier, high line was pulled across, carrying a waterproof container filled with specialized welding equipment and additional shoring material. This mid-sea exchange, performed in total darkness and heavy seas, was a testament to the seamless integration of United States Navy logistics. By 10:30 in the evening, the list had been reduced to 2 degrees. The Bataan's speed was increased to 14 knots, a slow but steady progress that moved the ship further away from the Iranian coast. The logistics of the rescue were transitioning into the logistics of recovery. Every hour of transit brought the ship closer to the umbrella of the carrier's land-based support and the specialized repair ships currently steaming from the naval base at Djibouti. The night remained a period of intense, quiet labor. On the bridge, the commanding officer watched the navigation display, his eyes tracing the line that would lead them to safety. The Bataan was a bruised and battered vessel, but she was still a sovereign piece of American territory, held together by the grit of her crew and the massive logistical reach of the Fifth Fleet. The immediate violence of the afternoon had faded, replaced by the slow, grinding reality of keeping 40,000 tons of steel afloat in a hostile sea. Midnight on the 13th of January, 2026, the central Gulf of Oman. USS Bataan moved through a sea the color of obsidian, her wake a pale, phosphorescent scar on the water. The primary fires had been declared extinguished 3 hours prior, leaving the aft third of the ship, a dripping, blackened skeleton of twisted steel and melted insulation. The internal atmosphere was thick with the smell of damp ash, scorched electronics, and the heavy, chemical scent of seawater mixed with firefighting foam. Portable emergency lights, powered by yellow cables snaking through the passageways, cast long, flickering shadows against the bulkheads, illuminating the faces of sailors who had been awake for over 20 hours. The preliminary damage assessment team, led by the executive officer and the chief hull technician, moved through the impact zone with clinical precision. They carried high-intensity flashlights and digital tablets, documenting the physical reality of the Noor missile strike. The hole in the port side hull was roughly 20 feet wide and 15 feet high, located 6 feet above the current waterline. While the immediate flooding had been contained by the shoring of the inner bulkheads, the structural integrity of the frame between the hangar deck and the vehicle storage area was compromised by over 40%. In the secondary hangar bay, the wreckage of one MH-60 Sierra helicopter sat like a crumpled insect. The aircraft had been caught in the initial blast wave, its rotor blades shattered, and its fuel tank ruptured. The deck beneath it was buckled into a shallow crater, and the overhead wiring harnesses hung down in charred, tangled webs. Every piece of equipment in the immediate vicinity, from maintenance stands to specialized toolkits, had been turned into lethal shrapnel. By the overpressure of the 364-pound warhead, the human cost of the engagement was recorded in a quiet corner of the ship's medical ward. The official report, transmitted to the Pentagon and Pacific Command, listed 6 personnel killed in action and 22 wounded. Of the wounded, 4 remained in critical condition aboard the USS Gerald R. while 18 were being treated on the Bataan for second-degree burns, shrapnel wounds, and severe smoke inhalation. The names of the fallen were held in a temporary digital file, awaiting notification of next of kin, a somber administrative task that underscored the gravity of the afternoon's violence. Despite the physical damage and the loss of life, the operational status of the ship remained, a testament to the resilience of the crew. The forward 2/3 of the USS Bataan were fully functional. The ship's command and control systems had been restored, and the forward flight deck was cleared for limited helicopter operations. The propulsion system, though restricted to 14 knots to prevent further stress on the buckled hull, was stable. The sailors were no longer in a state of frantic damage control. They had transitioned into a professional, rhythmic, watch-standing routine, their discipline serving as a shield against the exhaustion and grief that threatened to set in. "The ship is wounded, but she is not broken," the commanding officer noted in his daily log, his handwriting steady despite the slight vibration of the emergency generators. "The crew has performed beyond every expectation. We are maintaining our position within the strike group and moving toward the rendezvous point for heavy repair." 30 miles to the south, the USS Gerald R Ford and its escorting destroyers maintained a protective perimeter. The radar screens of the strike group were clear of immediate threats, but the electronic warfare suites remained active, scanning the Iranian coastline for any sign of renewed aggression. The regional waters were silent, the Iranian military having retreated into a defensive posture following the destruction of their coastal command node and the Noor battery. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern horizon, marking the exit from the Gulf of Oman into the open Arabian Sea. The transition was more than geographical. It was a move from the kill zone into the relative safety of the international shipping lanes. The battle for the ship had been won, and the focus was now shifting toward the long-term strategic implications of the strike. The United States Navy had absorbed a direct hit on a capital ship and remained on station, a clear signal of resolve in a region defined by its volatility. 6 in the morning on the 15th of January, 2026, the port of Duqm, Oman. 48 hours after the initial Noor missile strike, the USS Bataan finally came to a halt alongside a reinforced concrete pier in the Omani port. The transition from the high-intensity combat zone of the Gulf of Oman to the clinical, industrial environment of a deep-water repair facility was marked by a heavy, exhausted silence. The morning air was cool and dry, lacking the humid weight of the salt spray that had defined the crew's struggle for the last 2 days. As the heavy mooring lines were winched tight, the massive ship groaned one last time, a mechanical exhale as the strain on her buckled hull was finally transferred to the shore. The physical damage to the ship was even more jarring in the clear, harsh light of the Omani morning. The 20-foot hole in the port side was a jagged, blackened mouth that revealed the mangled internal structure of the hangar deck. Specialized salvage teams from the Navy's Supervisor of Diving and Salvage were already on the pier, their trucks filled with underwater welding equipment and structural steel. They looked up at the Bataan with professional respect. The fact that the ship was still floating, let alone moving under her own power after such an impact, was a testament to both American engineering and the grit of the damage control teams. The USS Gerald R Ford and its escorting destroyers did not enter the port. Instead, they remained 50 miles offshore, maintaining a continuous combat air patrol and a 360-degree sensor sweep of the region. The strike group had been reinforced by an additional squadron of F-22 Raptors operating out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The message from the United States Indo-Pacific Command was unmistakable. The wounding of the Bataan had not diminished the American presence in the region. It had intensified it. A somber memorial service was held on the forward flight deck of the Bataan just hours after docking. The crew stood in formation, their clean summer white uniforms a sharp contrast to the smoke-stained bulkheads and the charred wreckage of the aft elevator behind them. 6 pairs of empty boots stood at the front of the formation, each topped by a white sailor's cap. The sound of taps, played by a lone bugler from the ship's band, drifted across the quiet harbor, a haunting, 3-note melody that seemed to hang in the still air. The strategic results of the 48-hour engagement were summarized in a classified report delivered to the National Security Council. The Iranian Noor battery and its associated mobile launchers near Jask had been completely obliterated. The hardened underground command and control center in the central Makran range was a total loss. Its internal structure collapsed by the precision-guided bunker busters. Furthermore, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had lost 3 fast attack craft and over 40 personnel in the failed attempt to swarm the Bataan's escort. The cost of the Iranian aggression had been disproportionate. For the price of a single cruise missile hit on a non-primary combatant, the Iranian coastal defense network in the Eastern Gulf had been set back by a decade. The United States had demonstrated its ability to absorb a strategic blow and return fire with a precision and lethality that bypassed traditional air defenses. The regional deterrence, which had been momentarily tested, was now reinforced by the smoldering wreckage of the Iranian coastal installations. Casualty figures were finalized at 6 sailors killed in action and 24 wounded. All 24 wounded personnel were listed as stable, with the 4 most critical patients having undergone successful surgery aboard the Gerald R. Ford, before being airlifted to the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The families of the fallen had been notified, their grief becoming the hidden, lasting weight of a conflict that the world would mostly remember through satellite photos and tactical briefings. The USS Bataan would remain in Duqm for 3 weeks of emergency repairs to seal the hull before beginning the long transit back to the United States for a full dry dock overhaul. She would eventually return to the fleet, her hull patched and her systems upgraded. Carrying the invisible scars of the day, the Gulf of Oman turned into a furnace. The incident was officially recorded in the annals of the United States Navy as a successful defense of freedom of navigation, a clinical term for a day defined by fire, blood, and the absolute refusal of 40,000 tons of steel to sink. As the sun rose higher over the Omani desert, the work on the pier intensified. The sound of pneumatic drills and welding torches replaced the roar of jet engines and the crash of missiles. The crisis had passed. The immediate violence had settled into a cold geopolitical standoff, and the United States Navy remained exactly where it had been before the first alarm sounded. On watch, on station, and ready for whatever the horizon held next.